My name is Marju Himma. I am research fellow at the University of Tartu, and I specialize on journalistic practices and misinformation and information disorder in general in journalism. Not just only misinformation, but also disinformation and many other forms of that sort, which altogether make this information disorder. They're all challenges for journalists, because tackling what is misinformation, who is behind that, and who is leading the initiative behind distribution of false information, tackling that is quite challenging for journalists more and more, because it used to be that journalists just checked facts, relying on their sources. But nowadays, this not just checking sources and verifying facts, but thinking about who is behind the initiative of distributing any sort of information, how this information is produced, and how to verify this. This is getting more and more difficult these days. One example I can bring is how Russia somehow managed to get information about some health topic into some Indian newspaper in English. Of course, this newspaper had its online edition, and for some years it was not important because it was published there and it was available somewhere online. But at some point when this topic on this health issue was actual again, and it was found that, oh, we already have coverage on this topic, and it started to distribute itself online. Which means that this falsified information is able to distribute itself at some point when it becomes actual. Or another example, how that sort of information can be created or legitimized through journalism. Let's pretend that we have an NGO who is funded by some sort of organization, whether public or private. And they want to bring up their own agenda on some topic, for example, showing that this or that product is safe or unsafe. They produce a report which uses some sort of scientific-like methods. For example, doing a poll on something or questioning people and then analyzing this data they've gathered and presenting it as truth, presenting it as a scientific report, scientific study, and through that making, for example, a press release and then distributing this to journalists. And journalists and editors, well, they look at it as, well, it must be news or newsworthy, and it gets published. Usually it gets published online first, and when it's published online, you can already say, well, see, this is legitimized journalistic outlet. You must be able to trust journalists because they have to do fact-checking. But what if they don't? What if they just publish something that they get their hands on? And what if what they got their hands on was this falsified report? That sort of science wash or greenwash, or however we call it, washing the information in order to become legitimized and become true, or constructing information that is, well, in favor of someone's interests. This is how the misinformation is produced and distributed. One example I can bring is already from the 1950s. In the beginning of 1950s, there was this thing called tobacco strategy. Well, people started to smoke more than they used to. And at some point, there were researchers who found that, oh, cigarette smoke contains toxic chemicals that can cause cancer. And when the first study on that was published, the tobacco companies got really anxious. What's going on? What's going to happen now? Well, they hired a very good PR partner and asked, what can we do now on the communication side? What they did was that they established a committee which was focused on doing studies on tobacco smoke and the influence and the connections and relations with cancer. And they funded different studies on that. And then they cherry-picked those studies which showed that the tobacco smoke and the toxic chemicals in that do not have health impact or does not cause cancer. So this is called fighting science with science. Of course, they published, of course, they cherry-picked those studies and published and made it look like this is how it is. This is one of the earliest examples of science wash. But also after that, it is even these days, even nowadays, it's a very common practice to fight science with science. Letting something show or appear as science is good because science are smart, or because scientists are smart. They must know what they're doing, what they do must be true, it must be trustworthy, and so on. Different studies have shown that different age groups and different socio-demographic groups are differently vulnerable to misinformation and disinformation and malinformation. When we talk about teenagers, for example, then they know very well how to create different realities. For them, the virtual reality is somewhat different than the real life. But for example, middle-aged people who are not digital natives, they often have problems with actually differentiating what is real, what is not, and they are more prone to misinformation or false information of any sort, online especially, because people in their 50s or 60s, they consider that if something is written down, it must be true. I can trust that. But what if you can't? What if it's actually content marketing, or what if it's false information in someone's interest? So I think they are the most vulnerable group these days. But this is where the media and information literacy comes in. We cannot build gates to keep false information out and trustworthy information in. The filter must be within the people who consume the information. They are the ones who actually have to know what are the sources, are they trustworthy, or how to verify the information. Media and information literacy experts often tackle the teenagers, the young age groups, in order to teach them mill practices and skills and competences on that. But maybe we should also more focus on older people, on teachers, on parents, and on also officials who are tackling the same problems with misinformation and false information in general. Parents are a very important group. If we want to educate the children, we should first educate the parents, because they are the ones who show their practices and their examples from whom children learn. And also the teacher. If the child is wiser than the teacher, then it's uncomfortable for both sides. We should tackle those groups differently, separately from their children, because it can be very embarrassing if you know less than your child. And also officials in public and also in private sector, they also need support in tackling of false information, because we are living at the age of information overload, and it's getting harder and harder to actually put your finger on what is true and what is not, or what is the truth.